The sun hung high in the clear Parisian sky, casting a warm golden glow over the lush greenery of Parc des Buttes Chaumont. Laughter and chatter filled the air as families picnicked and children played, creating a vibrant tapestry of life. Among the visitors was Sophie Martin, a spirited young woman in her late 20s, who had decided to take her beloved puppy, Biscuit, out for a day of adventure. Biscuit, a lively golden retriever with floppy ears and an insatiable curiosity, tugged at his leash, eager to explore every inch of the park. Sophie chuckled as he darted toward a group of children tossing a frisbee, his tail wagging furiously. "Not too far, Biscuit," she called, her voice light with affection. As she settled onto a bench, Sophie watched her puppy interact with the other dogs and their owners. The park was a sanctuary for her, a place where she could escape the pressures of her job as a graphic designer and enjoy the simple joys of life. Today felt particularly special. The sun was shining, and Biscuit was in high spirits. Across the park, Julien Lefebvre, a man in his 30s with tousled dark hair and an air of melancholy about him, sat on a nearby bench. He observed the world around him with a distant gaze, lost in thought. Once an aspiring artist, Julien had faced hardships that left him feeling disconnected from the vibrant life he once knew. Today marked another attempt to break free from his solitude. His eyes caught sight of Sophie and Biscuit playing together. There was something magnetic about their bond. The way Sophie laughed as Biscuit chased after butterflies, his clumsy antics drawing smiles from passers-by. Julien felt a pang of longing. He missed the simple joy of companionship. After several minutes of watching from afar, Julien decided to approach Sophie. He stood up, brushing off his jeans as he took a deep breath to steady himself. As he walked closer, he rehearsed what he would say in his mind. Would it be awkward? Would she even want to talk to him? "Excuse me," he said softly as he reached Sophie's side. She looked up, surprised but intrigued by his gentle demeanor. "Hi, can I help you?" Sophie replied, her curiosity piqued. "I couldn't help but notice your puppy," Julien said, nodding toward Biscuit, who had now flopped down on the grass to catch his breath. "He's quite charming." Sophie smiled warmly. "Thank you. His name is Biscuit. He's full of energy, always getting into trouble." Julien chuckled lightly, feeling an unexpected warmth in their exchange. They began to chat about their lives. Sophie shared stories about her work and how Biscuit had become her loyal companion during tough times. Julien spoke about his art and how he often found inspiration in nature but struggled to reconnect with it after losing his way. As their conversation flowed effortlessly, neither noticed how time slipped away. The sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the park as they shared laughter and stories that hinted at deeper connections yet to be explored. Little did they know that this seemingly innocent day at the park would soon take an unexpected turn. One that would test their newfound bond and change their lives forever. The afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm, amber hue over Parc des Buttes Chaumont. Sophie and Julien had settled into an easy rhythm of conversation, their laughter mingling with the sounds of children playing and dogs barking. Biscuit, now fully recharged, scampered around them, chasing after fallen leaves and the occasional butterfly that flitted by. "So, how did you come up with the name, Biscuit?" Julien asked, his eyes twinkling with curiosity as he watched the puppy's antics. Sophie grinned, her cheeks flushing slightly. "It's a bit silly, really. When I first got him, he was so small and fluffy that he reminded me of a biscuit, soft and sweet. Plus, I love baking. It just felt right." Julien chuckled. "I can see it. He certainly has a personality that matches the name." "Do you bake often?" "Whenever I can. I work as a graphic designer during the week, but on weekends, I love to experiment in the kitchen. It's my way of unwinding," she replied, her eyes lighting up at the thought. "Maybe you could share some of your creations with me sometime," Julien suggested playfully, his heart racing at the prospect of spending more time with her. "Only if you promise to try them all, even the experimental ones." Sophie laughed. As they continued to chat, Sophie felt an unexpected connection forming between them. Julien was different from anyone she had met in a long time. There was a depth to him that intrigued her. She noticed the way he listened intently when she spoke, his expression shifting from amusement to contemplation as she shared her stories. Julien felt a warmth spreading in his chest as well. For the first time in months, he felt seen and heard. Sophie's laughter was infectious, and her passion for life reminded him of what he had lost along his journey through hardship. Just then, Biscuit bounded back to them, panting happily as he dropped a stick at Julian's feet. "Look, he wants you to play," Sophie said with a smile. "Is that an invitation?" Julian replied, raising an eyebrow playfully. "Absolutely. He loves fetch," she encouraged, tossing the stick across the grass. Julian stood up and took off after Biscuit, who sprinted joyfully after the stick. As he threw it again and again, laughter erupted between them like music in the air. Each throw brought them closer together, Julian's laughter mingling with Sophie's as they cheered for Biscuit's enthusiastic returns. But amidst their playful banter and shared smiles, a shadow lurked nearby, a figure watching from behind a tree. Mark Dubois, known around the neighborhood for his petty crimes and troubled past, had been observing Julian and Sophie for some time. He was drawn to their carefree joy but felt a twinge of envy gnawing at him. Mark had grown up on the streets of Paris and had learned early on that survival often meant taking what wasn't yours. Today was no different. He needed money to settle debts that were closing in on him like wolves circling their prey. His eyes narrowed as he spotted Biscuit, an easy target in this moment of blissful distraction. As Julian continued to toss the stick for Biscuit, Mark moved closer, his heart racing with anticipation. He knew what he was about to do was wrong, yet desperation clouded his judgment. He glanced back at Sophie and Julian, lost in their laughter, and made his move. Sophie caught sight of Mark just as he lunged toward Biscuit. "Hey, what are you doing?" she shouted instinctively, but it was too late. In one swift motion, Mark grabbed Biscuit by the collar and took off running down a narrow path leading away from the park. "No. Biscuit!" Sophie screamed as panic surged through her veins. She sprang to her feet, adrenaline coursing through her body as she raced after them. Julian turned sharply at Sophie's cry and saw Mark sprinting away with Biscuit in tow. Without thinking twice, he took off after them too, determination igniting within him. "Stop, thief!" Julian shouted as they dashed through the park's winding paths. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she chased after them, fear for Biscuit overshadowed everything else. She could hear Julian's footsteps behind her, his presence both reassuring and motivating as they raced into an uncertain future together. In that moment of chaos, neither Sophie nor Julian realized how their lives were about to change forever, a bond forged not just by laughter but now by urgency and fear as they pursued a thief who had stolen more than just a puppy. He had stolen their peace of mind. Sophie's heart raced as she sprinted down the narrow path, her eyes locked on the figure of Mark disappearing into the distance with Biscuit in tow. The park, once a haven of joy and laughter, transformed into a landscape of panic and desperation. She could hear the echo of Julian's footsteps behind her, a steady reminder that she was not alone in this frantic chase. "Hold on, Biscuit," Sophie shouted, her voice trembling with fear. She pushed herself harder, her lungs burning as she navigated through the throngs of park-goers who were blissfully unaware of the chaos unfolding around them. Julian was close behind, his breath coming in quick gasps. "This way," he called out, veering off the main path toward a smaller trail that led deeper into the park. He had spotted Mark darting around a cluster of trees, and instinctively knew they had to cut him off before he could escape. Sophie followed Julian's lead, her determination fueled by the thought of Biscuit, her loyal companion who had brought so much joy into her life. "We can't let him get away," she yelled, her voice filled with urgency. As they rounded a bend, they caught sight of Mark again. He was now running along a narrow alleyway that cut through the park's dense foliage. Julian picked up speed, his long legs gaining ground on the thief. "Stop, thief!" Julian shouted again, his voice echoing off the trees as he closed in on Mark. The thief glanced back, his eyes wide with panic as he realized he was being pursued. Sophie felt a surge of hope as she saw Julian gaining on Mark. "We're almost there," she encouraged, but just as they rounded another corner, Mark suddenly turned sharply and ducked behind a row of bushes. "Where did he go?" Sophie gasped, skidding to a halt as she scanned the area frantically. Julian slowed down beside her, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Over here," he called out suddenly, pointing toward an opening between two buildings that bordered the park. Without hesitation, they dashed toward it. As they emerged from the foliage into a narrow alleyway lined with graffiti-covered walls, they saw Mark at the far end, fumbling with Biscuit's collar. The puppy whimpered softly but remained surprisingly calm despite the chaos. "Let him go," Sophie shouted as she stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "He's not yours." Mark hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by Sophie's fierce determination. He looked back at them, Julian's imposing figure and Sophie's fiery spirit, and felt a flicker of doubt creep into his mind. But desperation won out. He tightened his grip on Biscuit's collar and took off again. "Don't let him get away," Julian urged as they both took off after Mark once more. The alleyway twisted and turned like a maze, littered with discarded bottles and old crates. With each step, Sophie felt her resolve harden. She couldn't lose Biscuit, not now when they were so close. As Mark reached another intersection in the alley, he glanced back again and saw Julian gaining on him. With a burst of adrenaline, he veered left into an even narrower passageway that led toward the street beyond. "Julian, he's heading to the street," Sophie cried out as they continued to chase after him. They burst out of the alley just in time to see Mark sprinting toward a busy road filled with cars and pedestrians. Panic surged through Sophie. If he made it to the street, there was no telling what would happen next. "Biscuit," she shouted desperately. Just then, as if sensing Sophie's fear, Biscuit squirmed free from Mark's grasp and darted toward Sophie. The puppy raced across the pavement just as a car swerved to avoid him. "No!" Sophie screamed as she lunged forward instinctively. In that split second of chaos, Julian reached out and grabbed Biscuit just before he could reach Sophie. The puppy yelped but was quickly scooped up into Julian's arms. Mark turned back in shock at the commotion behind him but saw only an opportunity for escape. He took advantage of their distraction and bolted down the street. "Julian, we have to go after him," Sophie urged breathlessly as she reached for Biscuit in Julian's arms. "I've got him. Let's go," Julian replied firmly, clutching Biscuit tightly against his chest while sprinting after Mark once more. With renewed determination coursing through them both, they dashed down the street in pursuit of the thief who had stolen not only Biscuit but also their sense of safety and peace. The thrill of adrenaline pushed them forward. They wouldn't stop until they reclaimed what was rightfully theirs, Biscuit and their sense of security in this vibrant city that had suddenly turned chaotic. The streets of Paris, usually filled with the sounds of laughter and music, now echoed with the frantic pounding of feet against cobblestones as Sophie and Julian pursued Mark. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, creating a surreal atmosphere that heightened their urgency. "Stay close," Julian shouted over his shoulder, clutching Biscuit tightly against his chest as they navigated through the bustling crowd. Sophie kept pace beside him, her heart racing not just from the exertion but from the fear of losing her puppy. Mark was fast, too fast. He darted between pedestrians, weaving through the throngs of people who were blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding around them. Sophie and Julian followed closely, their eyes locked on the thief as he rounded a corner and disappeared into a narrow side street. "Don't lose him," Sophie urged, her voice strained with determination. Julian nodded, his jaw set in concentration. They turned sharply into the side street, where the sounds of the busy main road faded into a distant hum. The alley was lined with quaint cafes and small boutiques, their charming facades starkly contrasting with the chaos of their chase. As they sprinted down the alley, Julian glanced at Sophie. "Are you okay?" he asked, concern etched on his face. "I'm fine. Just focus on catching him," she replied breathlessly, unwilling to let fear slow her down. They turned another corner and spotted Mark again. This time he was slowing down, glancing back over his shoulder as if assessing how far behind they were. In that moment of hesitation, Julian seized the opportunity to close the gap between them. "Now's our chance," he exclaimed, pushing himself harder. He felt Biscuit squirm slightly in his arms but held on tightly. He wouldn't let go now. Sophie matched his pace, adrenaline fueling her every step. "He's getting away," she shouted as Mark picked up speed again, sprinting toward a larger square filled with outdoor tables and people enjoying their evening meals. As they burst into the square, chaos erupted. People turned to see what was happening. Two young adults chasing a man who was clearly up to no good. The sight of Julian and Sophie barreling through caused a stir. Chairs scraped against cobblestones as diners stood up in confusion. "Stop him," a woman shouted, pointing toward Mark as he dashed past her table. "Biscuit," Sophie cried out again, her heart pounding as she caught sight of Mark gripping her puppy's collar once more. He had slowed down enough for them to catch up, but he was still determined to escape. "Get out of the way!" Julian yelled as he maneuvered around a group of startled tourists. He could see Mark now. He was nearly at the far edge of the square where a street opened up into a busier area. With every ounce of strength left in him, Julian pushed forward. "We can't let him get away," he urged Sophie as they both picked up speed again. Just then, Mark glanced back one last time and saw Julian closing in on him. Panic surged through him. He knew he had to act fast. He made a sharp turn toward an alley that led away from the square, an escape route that could lead him back into hiding. "Julian, he's going into that alley," Sophie shouted, pointing urgently. "Let's go," Julian replied without hesitation. They veered off after Mark once more, their determination unwavering despite their fatigue. As they entered the alleyway, it became narrower and darker, a stark contrast to the vibrant square they had just left behind. The air felt heavier here, filled with tension as they chased after Mark through dimly lit corners and scattered trash bins. Sophie could hear her heart pounding in her ears as they ran deeper into the alley. "We're almost there," she called out encouragingly to Julian. But just as they thought they were gaining ground, Mark suddenly stopped short at a dead end, a brick wall looming before him. He spun around to face them, breathing heavily but still clutching Biscuit tightly in his grasp. "Give me back my puppy," Sophie demanded fiercely, stepping forward despite her fear. Mark's eyes darted between them. Desperation mixed with anger twisted his features. "Stay back. I don't want any trouble," he warned, but there was a tremor in his voice that betrayed his bravado. Julian stepped protectively in front of Sophie, ready to confront Mark head-on if necessary. "You need to let him go," he said firmly but calmly. "You don't have to do this." Mark hesitated for just a moment. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face as he looked at Biscuit squirming in his grip. The puppy whined softly, sensing the tension and longing for Sophie's comforting presence. In that brief moment of vulnerability, Sophie took a step closer. "Please," she implored gently. "He's just a puppy. You don't have to hurt him or us." Mark's resolve wavered further as he looked at Biscuit, his heart softened by the puppy's innocent gaze and Sophie's compassion. But just then, sirens wailed in the distance, the unmistakable sound of police approaching, and panic surged through him again. "I can't go back. I can't," Mark muttered under his breath as he backed away from them toward the wall behind him. "Let him go. You don't need to run anymore," Julian urged desperately. But before they could react further, Mark made a split-second decision. With one swift motion, he tossed Biscuit toward Sophie before bolting down an adjacent alleyway just as police cars turned onto the street outside. "Biscuit!" Sophie cried out as she lunged forward instinctively to catch her puppy midair. She cradled him against her chest just as he landed safely in her arms. Julian turned to watch Mark disappear into the shadows of another alleyway, a fleeting figure lost to the night, but relief washed over him when he saw that Biscuit was safe in Sophie's embrace. "You did it! You caught him!" Julian exclaimed breathlessly as they both stood there for a moment, Biscuit squirming happily between them. Sophie looked down at Biscuit with tears of relief brimming in her eyes. "I thought I lost you," she whispered softly, showering her puppy with kisses while holding him tightly against her heart. Julian smiled at them both, a sense of camaraderie forming between them amidst the chaos they had just endured together. The sirens grew louder now. Help was on its way, but for now, all that mattered was that Biscuit was safe and sound in Sophie's arms. The sound of sirens grew louder as Sophie held Biscuit tightly against her chest, relief flooding through her. The puppy squirmed happily, licking her face with his warm, wet tongue. Julian stood beside her, catching his breath as he glanced down the alleyway where Mark had disappeared. "Do you think he got away?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling slightly as she stroked Biscuit's fur. The puppy nuzzled against her, sensing her distress. "I don't know," Julian replied, his brow furrowing in thought. "But we should stay here until the police arrive. They'll want to know what happened." Sophie nodded, still feeling the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The encounter had left her shaken, but the warmth of Biscuit in her arms provided comfort. She glanced at Julian, who was watching the alleyway intently. "Thank you for helping me," she said softly, breaking the silence that hung between them. I don't know what I would have done without you. Julian turned to her, a hint of a smile on his lips. I couldn't just stand by and watch. Biscuit is a part of your life. I had to do something. Just then, two police officers arrived at the entrance of the alley, their uniforms crisp and authoritative. What happened here? One officer called out as they approached. Sophie stepped forward, still cradling Biscuit protectively. A man stole my puppy. We chased him down here, she explained, gesturing toward the direction Mark had fled. Did you see which way he went? The second officer asked, scanning the area. He went that way, Julian said, pointing down the alley where Mark had disappeared. We tried to catch him, but he got away. The officers exchanged glances before one of them nodded. We'll send a unit to check that area. Can you both give us a description of the suspect? As they recounted the details of the chase and described Mark's appearance, Sophie felt a mix of gratitude and lingering anxiety. She couldn't shake off the feeling that they hadn't just lost a thief, they had lost a chance to understand what drove someone to such desperation. Once they finished giving their statements, the officers thanked them and assured them that they would do everything possible to locate Mark. As they left to pursue their investigation, Sophie turned to Julian. Do you think he'll get caught? She asked quietly. Julian shrugged, his expression thoughtful. I hope so, but I also wonder, why would someone do something like that? It's not just about stealing a puppy, it's about something deeper. Sophie nodded slowly, contemplating his words. You're right, it's easy to see him as just a criminal, but maybe there's more to his story. They stood in silence for a moment, both lost in their thoughts about Mark and his choices. Finally, Sophie broke the silence with a soft laugh that surprised even herself. I can't believe I almost lost Biscuit today. Julian shrugged, his expression thoughtful. I hope so, but I also wonder, why would someone do something like that? It's not just about stealing a puppy, it's about something deeper. Sophie nodded slowly, contemplating his words. You're right, it's easy to see him as just a criminal, but maybe there's more to his story. They stood in silence for a moment, both lost in their thoughts about Mark and his choices. Finally, Sophie broke the silence with a soft laugh that surprised even herself. I can't believe I almost lost Biscuit today. Julian shrugged, his expression thoughtful. I hope so, but I also wonder, why would someone do something like that? It's not just about stealing a puppy, it's about something deeper. Sophie nodded slowly, contemplating his words. You're right, it's easy to see him as just a criminal, but maybe there's more to his story. They stood in silence for a moment, both lost in their thoughts about Mark and his choices. Finally, Sophie broke the silence with a soft laugh that surprised even herself. I can't believe I almost lost Biscuit today. Julian shrugged, his expression thoughtful. I hope so, but I also wonder, why would someone do something like that? It's not just about stealing a puppy, it's about something deeper. Sophie nodded slowly, contemplating his words. You're right, it's easy to see him as just a criminal, but maybe there's more to his story. They stood in silence for a moment, both lost in their thoughts about Mark and his choices. Finally, Sophie broke the silence with a soft laugh that surprised even herself. I can't believe I almost lost Biscuit today. Julian smiled back at her, relieved to see her spirits lifting again. He's quite the little troublemaker, he said playfully as Biscuit wagged his tail enthusiastically in response. Yeah, Sophie agreed with a grin. And I guess I owe you one for saving him. Julian raised an eyebrow playfully. Just one. I think I deserve at least a few homemade biscuits for that. Sophie laughed genuinely this time, feeling lighter despite the earlier chaos. Okay, you've got yourself a deal. As they strolled back toward the park together, Biscuit happily trotting along beside them, Sophie felt an unexpected warmth growing between her and Julian. They shared stories about their lives over coffee at a nearby cafe, their laughter mingling with the sounds of Parisian life around them. But as they sat across from each other at a small table under an awning adorned with twinkling lights, Sophie couldn't shake off the lingering thoughts about Mark, the man who had stolen her puppy but also inadvertently brought her closer to Julian. What do you think will happen to him? She asked suddenly, her gaze drifting toward the street as if searching for answers. Julian paused thoughtfully before responding. I think it depends on whether he chooses to change or not. Everyone has their struggles. Sometimes it just takes hitting rock bottom for someone to realize they need help. Sophie nodded slowly, appreciating his perspective. You're right. Maybe there's still hope for him. With that thought lingering in her mind, Sophie felt an unexpected sense of connection forming between her and Julian. A bond forged not only through shared laughter but also through compassion for someone who had been lost along the way. As dusk settled over Paris and stars began to twinkle in the sky above them, Sophie realized that this day, filled with chaos and fear, had transformed into something beautiful, a newfound friendship, and perhaps even more than that. Little did they know that their paths were destined to intertwine further, a journey not only toward understanding each other but also toward discovering what it truly meant to be compassionate in a world filled with complexity and struggle. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the Parisian streets as Sophie and Julian finished their coffees. Biscuit lay contentedly at their feet, his little body curled up in a ball, blissfully unaware of the chaos of the day. The air was filled with the scent of freshly baked pastries from the cafe, mingling with the sounds of laughter and conversation from nearby tables. I can't believe how much has happened today, Sophie said, shaking her head in disbelief. It feels like a whirlwind. Julian nodded, his expression thoughtful. It's amazing how one moment can change everything. I'm just glad Biscuit is safe. Sophie smiled down at her puppy, who had begun to stir and stretch. He certainly knows how to keep life interesting, she said fondly. As they sat in comfortable silence, Sophie's thoughts drifted back to Mark, the man who had stolen her puppy and sparked this unexpected connection between her and Julian. She felt a pang of empathy for him, despite his actions. Do you think he'll really get caught? She asked quietly. Julian sighed, leaning back in his chair. I hope so, but more than that, I hope he finds a way to turn his life around. It's clear he's struggling with something deeper. Sophie nodded, her heart heavy with compassion. I can't help but wonder what led him to that point. Maybe if someone had reached out to him before, maybe he wouldn't have felt like stealing Biscuit was his only option. Julian looked at her, impressed by her insight. You're right, it's easy to judge someone from the outside without understanding their story. Maybe we could do something, Sophie suggested suddenly, her eyes lighting up with an idea. We could start a community outreach program or something, help people like Mark get back on their feet. That's a great idea, Julian replied enthusiastically. We could partner with local shelters or organizations that support those in need. It might not change everything, but it could make a difference for someone. Sophie felt a rush of excitement at the prospect of turning their experience into something positive. Let's do it. We could brainstorm ideas and see what resources are available in the community. As they continued to discuss their plans, Sophie realized how much she appreciated Julian's perspective. His kindness and willingness to help others resonated deeply with her values. The bond they were forming felt genuine and meaningful. Just then, Biscuit jumped up, barking playfully as he spotted another dog across the street. Sophie laughed as she watched him prance around excitedly, his earlier ordeal seemingly forgotten. Looks like someone is ready for another adventure, Julian said with a grin. Definitely. Let's take him for a walk, Sophie suggested, feeling invigorated by their conversation and the promise of new beginnings. They stood up and headed out into the bustling streets of Paris, Biscuit leading the way with boundless energy. As they walked side by side, Sophie felt a sense of ease between them, a shared understanding that transcended words. After wandering through charming streets lined with twinkling lights and quaint shops, they found themselves at the Seine River. The water shimmered under the moonlight, creating a picturesque backdrop for their newfound friendship. Thank you for being there today, Sophie said sincerely as they paused to take in the view. I don't think I would have been able to handle it alone. Julian turned to her, his expression earnest. I'm glad I was there too. It's funny how life brings people together in unexpected ways. Sophie smiled softly, feeling warmth spread through her chest. I never expected to meet someone like you today, someone who understands compassion and kindness so deeply. Julian took a step closer, looking into her eyes with sincerity. And I never expected to find someone who inspires me to be better, to think beyond myself. In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of Paris at night and the gentle lapping of the river against the shore, Sophie felt an undeniable connection between them. A spark that hinted at something more than friendship. But just as she opened her mouth to speak again, Biscuit tugged at his leash playfully, breaking the tension as he darted toward a group of people gathered nearby. They both laughed as they followed him over. As they approached the gathering crowd, they discovered it was an open-air art exhibit showcasing local artists' work, paintings and sculptures illuminated under soft lights. "Look at this," Julian exclaimed as he pointed toward a vibrant painting depicting a bustling Paris street filled with life and color. Sophie admired it closely. It reminded her of their day, the chaos mixed with beauty, and suddenly felt inspired by their shared experience. "I love this," she said excitedly. "It captures everything we've been through today, the joy and struggle all mixed together." Julian nodded in agreement as they moved from piece to piece, discussing each artwork and sharing their thoughts on art and life. The evening unfolded effortlessly. Laughter flowed freely between them as they explored together. As they reached the end of the exhibit, Sophie turned to Julian with newfound determination shining in her eyes. "Let's make our plan happen. Let's help those who need it most." Julian smiled broadly at her enthusiasm. "Absolutely. Together we can make a difference." With Biscuit happily wagging his tail beside them, they walked back toward the park where their adventure began. This time not just as two strangers brought together by circumstance but as friends united by purpose and compassion. And as they strolled through the streets of Paris under a blanket of stars, both Sophie and Julian knew that this day had changed them forever, not just because of what had happened but because of what lay ahead, a journey toward understanding themselves and others in ways they had never imagined possible.